Thank you for viewing this American Sewing Guild educational series on creating an enclosed seam finish. An enclosed seam finish places both cut edges toward the center. They are pressed and then sewn together, encasing or enclosing both cut edges of the seam allowances to prevent raveling. This type of seam allowance finish is good for light to medium weight fabrics. Enclosed seams can be used for children's play clothes or blouses or even pant side seams. This seam allowance finish can also be used on sheer fabrics in place of a French seam. Due to the nature of the seam, it would not be good for coats or jackets out of a heavyweight fabric. Create a plain seam, placing right sides together, sew the seam and meld the stitches, and then press open. Beginning with one of the seam allowances, fold the cut edge to the seam line and then finger press in place and then press in place. The first side is completed. Fold the remaining seam allowance cut edge toward the seam line. Press and fold in place. With both edges pressed, bring the folded edges together at the center and then press them together. The folded edges should meet, and the cut edges will be encased inside. Sew the seam allowances together along the fold using a regular stitch length. The seam is now encased. From the right side of the project, the seam will look like a plain seam. Press the seam to one side. Let's watch how to enclose a seam. Prepare a plain seam. Meld the stitches and then press open. With the seam allowances facing up, fold back the right seam allowance matching the cut edge of the seam allowance almost to the sewn seam line. Press in place. Repeat this all the way down the seam allowance. Once one side is done, repeat for the other side. When both seam allowances are folded toward the seam line and pressed, bring the folded edges together. And then press again. Set the machine for a straight stitch and regular stitch length. Place the folded and pressed edges together and edge stitch along the folds. Move the needle position if necessary and use the inside edge of the toe of the presser foot to guide the stitching. Stop with the needle in the fabric and adjust the folds as needed while continuing to stitch the folded edges together. Backstitch at each end of the seam allowance. And trim the threads close to the stitching. The cut edges of the seam allowances are now encased to prevent raveling. Thank you for viewing this American Sewing Guild video. If you have any questions, email Ramona at asg.org. The American Sewing Guild is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to people who believe sewing is a rewarding and creative activity. If you enjoyed this video, join ASG to view our library of in-depth educational videos on various sewing topics. They are free to members. Members also enjoy discounts from vendors who support our organization along with many other benefits.